guy keeps pulling it in out. It's probably fake, but you know what? It's scaring the guy. Yep. Yep.
What does he look like?
Hat on.
Are you hurt?
Gray. Gray coat with black sleeves.
Thanks for being here tonight. I'm Alison, Cuddy. I'm the Marilynn Thoma Artistic Director of the Chicago Humanities Festival. I'm proud to be partnering on this program with the Museum of Contemporary Art. What you just saw was Dead Air, a piece by the artist Danny Giles, who's here with me. And maybe we could thank you so much for doing that performance, and thanks to all the, can we give a round of applause to the So, we're here tonight to talk about a really seminal exhibition in Chicago art history and Chicago history and the kind of context around it. And part of the aim of that show was to use art as a way of engaging with the larger world. And so I wanted to start, Danny, just by asking you quickly to talk a bit about how this piece, in particular, but your work more generally, in some ways is engaging with the larger world, is thinking about social ills, police violence, and issues like that.
Mm-hmm. So that piece that you just saw was made 3 years ago. I was participating in a show at the old Three Walls space, if any of you know. Three Walls is a nonprofit art space in Chicago here. It was a show curated by a group called Maker TV. It's called Direct Object, Direct Action. So we were thinking about direct political actions and a video feed as a platform to focus on a few artists' practices. So this piece was created to be viewed live on a live feed. So I was thinking about television and social media and the internet and the news cycle as a space where we witness a lot of graphic depictions of violence, arrest, murder, police abuses daily, and the rate at which those images come into our lives can be really overwhelming. So I was thinking about how to process these events without imagery or with limited imagery as a formal sort of place to start. From there, I was thinking about who we think about when we think about these instances of violence or police abuse is often rightfully the victim of those abuses, of those encounters, who ends up arrested or often injured or dead. But I also wanted to think about the perpetrator of that violence and figure out a way to represent that position. So the text that was on the screen was appropriating from several texts of both literary and actual texts of individuals who had perpetrated that kind of violence. So some text was taken from Native Son, some was taken from Crime and Punishment, and then there were other police testimonies, Darren Wilson's testimony, some of that, and some anonymous testimonies. Sort of folded in with 911 dispatches here in the case of Tamir Rice's shooting, audio from Richard Ramirez's shooting in Billings, Montana, and bringing those together along with this representation of a die-in, which is a sort of iconic protest gesture.
Yeah, the performance itself, so
right.
That was the kind of connection there.
Right.
Thank you. With us also is Julie Rodrigues Widholm, who is the director and chief curator of the DePaul Art Museum, and then Greg Foster Rice, who's an associate professor of the history of photography at Columbia College, and is the curator of a show that will have some relevance to tonight's discussion, The Many Hats of Ralph Arnold, Art, Identity, and Politics at the Museum of Contemporary Photographer. And Ralph Arnold has a piece in the MCA program that we're talking about. And so, which you'll see that images from the '68 show and then images from the Ralph Arnold show are circulating, and we're going to talk about some of those. And you know, our aim here is to think both about that show and what was happening, the larger context around it, but also thinking about contemporary art and how and artistic practices like those of yours, Danny, and how those might be engaged with some of the same issues. Before we talk about the MCA 68 show, I just wanted Julie or Greg, if you had any responses to the performance as well, or questions for Danny.
Well, first I'll say it's extremely moving to see the live human figure addressing these issues. For me, having the bodies walking and moving and then still on the ground, it creates a certain visceral experience of the testimony, the writing, and sort of reminding us that these are human flesh bodies that we're talking about. These are not statistics. These are not just newspaper headlines. And I think that's it's often important. It's often what gets lost is the humanity and the human being behind these headlines. So I find that really kind of a very important thing that you're doing.
Yeah, I would just add, it's a very powerful statement to me about not just the physical violence of an act of violence, but initially the disorienting quality of the performance. To me, really addresses the disorienting nature of violence, that it unmoors us, that it is psychologically damaging to the survivors and to the perpetrators, and it unmoors people from their normal state. Violence is an awful, violence perpetuated between people is an awful thing, and thankfully it's not even more prevalent than it is, but when it is prevalent, it does have this incredible opportunity to sort of take people out of their regular systems of interhuman contact and sociality and the way that we operate as human beings. And I think the piece really captures quite tragically how that happens as we're trying to sort of decipher whose words are whose and where are these coming from and trying to interpret the piece. So I found that to be very powerful and moving.
And I was struck that we've spent the year exploring the theme graphic, which has two basic premises. One, that we live in this increasingly visual world, and visual communication, visual technology is affecting how we interact with the world. And two, that exactly as you were saying, Danny, that a lot of that visuality is extreme, it's violent, it's graphic in those senses. And so is there a necessary correlation between those things, and how are they a reflection of or a response to this, how is art a reflection or response to this moment? And that seemed to be kind of one of the contexts for the MCA 68 show. And I just wanted to quote from the program, the curator of the show put together, in the catalog, put together this essay, and it begins with a set of questions. Why are we as a nation so passionately fond of guns? Why have we, above all people, elevated the gun-toting criminal to the role of folk hero? What does our interest in violence as an adjunct to entertainment signify? What needs do the murders and gory mayhem in our films and TV programs fill in our lives? Has the immediacy of our TV coverage of the war in Vietnam made us indifferent to sudden death? Has that immediacy translated itself into riot and reprisals on our streets? Do we resort to personal violence more easily or more viciously than other people? In short, are we really what most of the world sees us as being, the most trigger-happy, sanguinary of people? So it's this whole question about American identity. And I wonder, Greg, maybe you could start us off. How did this show come about? It was, as I said, a seminal show in the MCA's history, only its second exhibition, and the first to really say, let's explore the world around us. Let's talk about the political climate of 1968.
The show had its origins in an essay that that Robert Glauber, who was a curator for Illinois Bell, had written in Skyline, which was a local newspaper, about violence in American art, and he had talked about this in the summer of 1968, and he had addressed some of the artists who would end up being in this show. And then Jan Vandermark, the director of the museum, was really impressed by this essay and the fact that it took this tone, and that the museum might be able to step forward and address the prevalence of violence in American society at that time period. Remember, April of 1968 was the west side of Chicago, when Mayor Richard J. Daley told the police that they could shoot with impunity any looters, and that's an incredibly violent moment in Chicago history. There had been a series of violent police responses to protests around the country in 1967 and earlier in 1965. And then by August 25th of 1968, you have the Democratic National Convention and the police riot against the protesters there too. At this point, the show was already underway. And then we talked a little bit about this, but there were a number of other artistic responses that came about. Artists outside of Chicago decided that as a result of Richard J. Daley's, the police response to the protesters, that they would boycott Chicago. And so then Chicago artists had to realize, like, well, how are we going to address this as a burgeoning art community? How are we going to respond to artists outside of our city boycotting us because of the political violence that was being sown here against the citizens of Chicago and people who had come to visit?
Right. It's so fascinating because that part of the way the riots or the protests and the response to them at the convention were characterized by the powers that be was that it was outside agitators, right, coming into our city and making this happen. But in fact, it was about police brutality. I mean, what was happening at the convention was about the politics and the war, but it was also about very specific Chicago things. Julie, can you talk a little bit to that and about the larger context in which this show is unfolding?
Well, I think, 1968 was a volatile year in Chicago, but also nationally. So MLK, there are so many assassinations that through the media were portrayed and kind of experienced. That there was this, and I think the exhibition argues pretty forcefully that this is kind of a national consciousness or almost a zeitgeist or a characteristic of this country, which is a very strong statement to make in an exhibition. Mm-hmm. I would say very few exhibitions these days would argue something so forcefully about the characteristic of our country. So I think the rise of the media is a very strong part of that, and how so many artists, Rauschenberg, Warhol, even before then, were using newspaper imagery, and a lot of the works in the exhibition in 1968, including Ralph Arnold, are using collage. They're using photo-based imagery from the newspaper, from reproduced material, and I think this kind of not reportage, but using the facts of the news, it was really fodder for the artists in a way that maybe hadn't been previously. And this kind of the evidence of the news or the images of the news that you kind of can't escape is something that allowed for the artists in the show to be very direct and speak to the social moment very directly in a way that a popular consciousness and audience could appreciate. Mm-hmm. So moving away from a kind of formalism of modern art and engaging with very real, pressing, urgent issues. And kind of interesting at that time, pressuring other artists to do the same, right? So this sort of boycott or really pressuring your fellow artists to say, well, why aren't you responding? Why are you continuing to make your abstract paintings? We have to address this. But it's complicated. I mean, it wasn't sort of everyone was on board. You had some artists who were like, listen, art is art, and that's that. And I'll be a politician if I want to address that. I'm an artist. So I think it raised also a lot of questions about what is the role of an artist in society.
Yeah. Yeah, Danny, can you speak to that as well? I mean, I am struck by, in the way that your piece and the work that you do, in a way that may seem very familiar to us now, this multimedia, and as you were saying, Julie, sort of bringing in this theme that will recur, like bringing the world outside into the show through, for example, the use of newspaper. How do you respond? What struck you about the works in this show and the forms that they were using to think about violence?
Yeah, I was thinking about collage a lot, Ralph Arnold and Rauschenberg, and a lot of this sort of almost like primary source, studio-based, image-based work. And looking at those installation shots of the show, I was struck actually by how, you mentioned that it's sort of anti-formalist, but it felt very formal in a way in that everything was an image for the most part, or an object and kind of sat still in space. And so thinking about a lot of contemporary artists' response to, our moment, whether that has to do with violence or any other political sort of subject, there's a lot more movement now. There's a lot more performance happening. There's a lot more social practice projects happening, and I think the sort of embodiment part of it, I feel like these subjects were embodied through these sort of still images and these sort of like media representations in a way that felt very much of that time. People are making paintings and sculptures, and there's a little bit of sort of experimentation around those boundaries of like what constitutes a painting or a sculpture, but for the most part, everything kind of cohered to a, to it stayed in its place.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was sort of one thing I picked up on in thinking about, all of the other art movements that were starting to come up at this moment as well, around body art and performance that didn't take center stage in that exhibition.
In that exhibition,
yeah.
But will take center stage in art as we move forward.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it felt like in some of the critical response, so we had access to the archive of the show and we're able to look at some of the materials that you see represented here, but that, the work that some critics said is graphic, in other words, is not art per se, or not the medium of art, as you were saying, and then whether painting was really up to the challenge of talking about violence in the way that the show aspired to. But it is fascinatingly an effort to catalog violence, right? So distinguish kinds of violence: personal violence, gun violence, racial violence, the climate of violence. What was up with that, Greg? I mean, why do you think that was the approach of this show?
Well, I think part of it was, as Julie was indicating, was a response to the mass media. And there were some serious questions that they raised about, is the mass media perpetuating in the sort of the role of depictions of violence of violent heroes? So the Robert Rauschenberg piece that's in the show, those are depictions from the Bonnie and Clyde movie, which had come out in 1967, the year before, and was scandalous to people because of the graphic violence, to use that word, that it showed. And there were serious questions about, is that media reflecting, or is it actually shaping people to want to participate and to be more accepting of violent behavior? And the curators seem to indicate that on one of the sheets that's up there. There's some questions they raise. Is violence ugly? Is violence beautiful? What's the difference between violence in art and destruction in art? And there were artists at that time period who were doing things like destroying their art. And in some people, in their response directly to the protests in Chicago and the police response to it was to destroy their art and to say, I'm not participating in this anymore. Klaus Oldenburg canceled his show at Richard Feigen Gallery. He's like, I can't have a one-person show that's about art and pleasure in the midst of, I just got abused by the police in Chicago. And so that was one of the initial responses. And then Feigen has to come forward with a different show as a way to try to show, well, how are Chicago artists going to engage with this material? And he comes up with this show, The Richard J. Daley Show, in which he offers artists an opportunity to try to flip that, like, if we're going to be boycotted by artists from the coast who aren't going to come to Chicago, how are we going to show that we're going to respond to the issues of violence that are happening here?
That we're not complicit with
we're not
it.
Gonna, yeah, we're not complicit. We have to show that we're going to engage with this in some way, because artists around the country are, to a certain extent, looking at us like, what are you going to do? How are you going to respond to this? So I think that that's a really strong imperative for the exhibition, to sort of push it forward. The exhibition was already planned at this point, but I think it helped those shows that happened in November, October and November immediately prior to this show, kind of primed the pump so that audiences came into this show expecting quite a lot about how it was going to address violence.
So I just happened to have found Grace Glueck of the New York Times wrote a review of the Richard Daley Show at Feigen in '68, and I thought it was interesting, to read a critic's response to that show at that time. And she says, the show goes in for the quick journalistic jab, relying heavily on boyish scatology, name-calling, and sight gags to make its protest points. So I think if we think, there are various ways where protest art can occupy space and visual space and aesthetic space, but I thought that was an interesting critique of what she was saying through this effort to create a really strong social statement through art. And she's like, okay, well, that's what I'm saying. And there are many points to critique in the 1968 exhibition here. I mean, there were only 2 women in the show. Mm-hmm. And I think there are, in some of the writing, the curator's writing, the essay in the catalog is highly problematic, where he's very much stereotyping and generalizing Mexicans, Africans, and the state of violence in these, populations. So while I think the impetus is interesting, it's also a very distinct show in terms of the response the MCA was making so quickly, right? So I think the article came out in July '68, and the exhibition opened today, exactly today, 50 years ago. November 8th, 1968 is when this show opened. And for a museum, granted, it's a very young museum, they probably weren't planning a year ahead, but it's a very quick response exhibition, and something that we as museums today very rarely would do. To kind of mobilize and have that kind of quick response, let alone have an exhibition organized by the writer of an article and an essay and just hand over the museum to him. That's also kind of distinct, I would say, for how we operate today.
Yeah. Danny, there was a criticism of the show that it reported on rather than responded to violence. And I wonder, again, how much that is about this using the media as a kind of subject and the content, of the work in some way, like not just we're talking about media, but we're using it as some of our material. But one of the critiques was these artists are incapable of dealing with violence directly and with feeling, that it was reporting on rather than responding to violence, possibly because few of them have experienced it, just as Americans in general have no experience and therefore no conception of the devastation of war in their own land. And I wonder how that resonates with you when you think about representing violence and some of the problematic elements of this show that it raises about kind of stereotypes. But where is that idea of what does your connection to the events, the experiences that you're trying to depict in your art have to lie in order to have that kind of legitimacy or authenticity around representing them?
I think about representation in my work as almost an impossible task. So while I'm approaching imagery or content drawn directly from, say, a moment in time or a specific narrative, I'm always contending with the fact that to get back to that moment, to feel what it must have been like to be on the ground or to be in police headlights is a really difficult task, really, and that most of the time we're experiencing these things through a screen and through a sort of mediated kind of representation, which is different than an embodied experience. So I think performance is a big way that a big strategy for me to think about embodiment and think about getting as close maybe to a space of lived experience as possible, while acknowledging a sort of impossibility of being there. And so in this work, I think the removal of imagery and the video was a strategy that I was working with to almost that disorientation of not having the video corresponding to the sound might invite the viewer to actually be more, find themselves more enveloped within that space by having to project into it. And then in other works, thinking about participation and group performance as a way to sort of collectively invoke those feelings and those sort of contexts with this acknowledgement of it, that sort of distance that's always going to be there.
Right. I mean, much of your work is thinking specifically about policing, right? And the ways in which that invades people's lives. Like I'm thinking about the piece that you did that was sort of, you took the blue lights that the police used to indicate a high crime area or a perceived high crime area, and then repurposed those as kind of a light for a dance party, for example, kind of a space of a very different kind of community and communion and organization.
Yeah.
And policing was, I mean, it wasn't just the context for this show, Greg, but there were also works that tried to represent this kind of police violence as well. There was the Ed Kleinholt's Bad Cop, Peter Holbrook's Battle of Grant Park, which attempted to depict what had actually happened. How much of that was like a theme of this work or the other work that was happening in some of these other shows you were talking about, Julie?
Well, I think, it's a really good point that Danny makes about that if the works, some of the works that I think are most successful in the show are the ones that do engage as sort of an embodied viewer. And so the Ed Keinholz attempted to do that. That's the piece that's circulating through the imagery here. It's called A Bad Cop, and it's actually an upright sculpture that is about sort of the size of a human form, and it has a gun pointed directly out at you, and it has a sort of a microphone coming out of it, and it actually talks to you because it was plugged into the wall, and it had a police band scanner in it that was apparently wherever it was shown would be playing local police band scanners, which was an interesting way to bridge that divide of real life outside of the museum and then the artistic space that's normally sort of a walled off white cube away from reality, to constantly be hearing those police band scanners, which in the fall of 1968 would have been the police rounding up people who are, suspected members of the Black Panthers or a communist organization or some sort of other sort of, group. And so that would have been really, I think, that would have been a moment where your body in front of this thing and it has a pistol pointed directly at you, you would have had a really embodied, visceral response to it. So I think that's a really good point to make, is the different strategies that artists do to try to do that. And that was one way to address police violence. And when that piece was actually first shown in 1961, the curator, Walter Hopps, when he showed it in Los Angeles, he was very concerned because the title of the piece was A Bad Cop, and then in parentheses, Lieutenant Carter. And it had a picture of that officer on the top of the piece, on top of a phallic signifier on top of the piece. So it's like making all these references. And he was very concerned because it pointed directly to a specific person, a specific cop who had committed a bad act as a police officer in Los Angeles. So that's another way in which it becomes, I think, an embodied experience, is it points directly to a particular bad actor. So,
Julie, were you going to jump in on? No, okay.
I was just thinking about just the context again of 1968 and how even the Afro-Cobra artists who were working, or Obasi, who were making the Wall of Respect, were on an FBI watch list.
Yes.
Right. So there's like
that's the climate.
Yeah, the lines between what your subjectivity is or how you're perceived, whether you're being perceived by the police or there's a lot of kind of blurring there, right? I mean, that's sort of one of the ways that we think about what happened at the convention, for sure. And deliberate blurring. I mean, not just like we don't know what's going on, but deliberately kind of conflating artist and agitator or something like that. Yeah. There was this sense that as much as the show was bringing in the outside world and trying to kind of like literally, as you're saying in the Keinholz piece, but engage with that world, one of the critiques was that it would have been a more enlightening show if it had acknowledged that American art, and this is a quote, is just as surely an aggressive purveyor of violent attitudes as it is a compendium of injured reactions to them. So is that reflecting on art as a medium that can, just like television or film, promote violence or traffic in violence? Where has that gone? And when we think about artists now who are trying to engage with kind of social issues or thinking about violence and the nature of violence, I mean, is it more reflective in that sense on the art world itself, I guess?
I think now artists are more quick to take each other to task for mishandling content. So that might be a difference between this moment and back then. I'm not sure that, say, for example, Andy Warhol's Little Race Riot piece, made in the context of his work back in the 60s, kind of made a lot of sense, but the way in which it kind of puts, his practice juxtaposes Elvis and Marilyn Monroe and a black Southerner being taken down by, a German Shepherd on the same level, wouldn't make sense today as looking at his practice as a whole. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a lot more engagement with each other's work now, and a lot more awareness of kind of being able to walk the walk, or being able to stand behind the work and have it have some substance behind sort of like a representational image.
There's so much. I mean, ranging from the Dana Schutz incident, right, of open casket, where a white female painter, does not necessarily have ownership, or it's problematic for her to depict this certain history and this certain experience. So I think that's a factor, kind of alluding to what you're saying, in that artists are being called to task and how they are using this imagery, which is very loaded, very painful imagery. I also just wanted to mention that Kim Pinder, who was an art historian in Chicago for a long time, organized an exhibition just in 2015 called Necessary Force, Art in the Police State. And so a whole group thematic exhibition around the police state in 2015 demonstrates how far we've not come since 1968, I think, and how there are, and this was a group show of, it looks like, about 20 artists addressing this very pressing cultural, social, political issue today. But then on the other spectrum, I might refer to someone like Dora Salcedo, who's a Colombian artist, who's dealt with violence her entire career, but from a very different perspective, not representing it, and it's not about necessarily the police state generally. What she does is she collects testimonies from victims of violence, which is why I think your use of testimony and kind of evidence and recordings is quite interesting, to think about the role of specificity of individuals in an art practice about violence. So she will interview victims, and then she kind of transforms their narratives and their stories into work that is not specific, but is actually more a kind of almost familiar experience of mourning. So she creates objects that we can all project onto the sense of mourning. So she talks about not reinscribing violence onto her work. She never wants to do that. She wants to actually create collective spaces for public mourning and grief, so that it begins with these violent acts, but it does not end there. It actually takes us to a different space of mourning collectively. She makes a lot of public art for that reason, because she feels that as a society, we have no place to grieve and mourn collectively, and we need that. So that's kind of two different sides of where we are today, I think.
Yeah. I want to open it up to questions from the audience, but before we do that, I just wanted to give you, Greg, the opportunity to talk a little bit about Ralph Arnold, because you're doing this whole show, and I mean, obviously we are returning to this period, to the artists of this period, and kind of reevaluating their work, and so maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what Ralph Arnold tells us about that interest now.
I mean, he's a really interesting figure in terms of the exhibition itself. I think you can kind of see up there his name. The curators couldn't quite decide whether his work addressed gun violence or personal violence, and it kind of moves up and down. And Danny, I was really struck by your comment about, like, a lot of these artists hadn't directly, experienced some of this violence before. Arnold is probably one of the few people in the exhibition who had. As a queer artist of color, he'd experienced social violence and sort of stereotyping and sort of issues in his personal life a lot. He was also a Korean War veteran. So it's interesting, I hadn't actually ever really thought about the fact he's probably one of the few people in the show who'd been shot at people and had experienced that. And so he was part of, veterans protesting the Vietnam War and the conflict during that time period. But he created a piece that was in the show called Unfinished Collage, which again I think is one of the pieces that does try to address the body in a way, in that it's this three-paneled triptych that addresses the lives and the successes, but also then the shared political assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. And it's a really poignant piece, and it was described by the reviewer in the Chicago Tribune as the most disturbing piece in the show, because it's called Unfinished Collage, and you have to circumnavigate the piece in order to come around to on the back of the triptych. It has an unfinished panel, and the fact that it is a portent to future violence, and that people were trying to figure out, well, who's going to fill in that fourth panel. And in order connecting 1968 to 2018, I have to say it's been a really interesting experience. We've done this show reassessing the work of Ralph Arnold's career. It opened on October 11th, and it's been really interesting getting people sort of talking about his career, his work as a central artist in Chicago, and the fact that a queer artist of color was somebody who was centrally located within and working with members of AfriCobra, Chicago Imagists, and other. We have a much more complex history of Chicago to continue to uncover. But there was a part of me that thought, the work speaks to our contemporary moment, but it's still historical, right? But then 2 weeks ago, to have that moment where I'm giving tours to students through the unfinished collage, and I'm talking about the partisan politics of the 1960s and how it led to political violence, you could no longer say that had we were beyond that moment. It was a very, very grim moment with the pipe bombings, the shooting in the synagogue. There was the shooting last night. We don't really know the exact causes or motivations behind it, but it's a fresh reminder that this work does still speak to the ongoing violence and fascination with violence in America. And these are really deep questions. And I think that the artists of today are, to the full credit of them, they're engaging in it. If the artists in the 60s were bringing the world into the art gallery, the artists of today are taking the art out into the communities, and through social activist art and through the work of people like Monica Trinidad and Paige May and others, they're social activists as artists and vice versa. And I think that that's a really interesting shift that's been happening over the course of the past 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. Well, that dynamic the show sets up, is there a particularly American form of violence? Is it like innate in our character or something? And then also this sense of, are we inured to violence? Are we somehow detached from it? Like, we're particularly violent and we're detached about that violence is a really strange thing that I don't think we've fully unraveled, right, about American culture. But I want to invite you to add your questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So are we going to bring the house lights up? If you raise your hand, someone will bring a microphone to you, and just wait for the microphone to get to you so we can hear what you have to say.
Hi.
Hi.
I particularly liked the opening piece, but what struck me after something that was that dramatic in so many ways was that it took you guys 45 or 50 minutes to address the shootings that happened last night. And that's kind of concerning to me, because this all becomes very abstract. So my question is, what is the role, you could ask, what is the role of all of us as citizens in view of that violence, but what is also the role of the artist when we are living in such a violent society? The role and the responsibility.
Yeah, could we bring the house lights up just a little bit more, because we still can't see. So the woman who's asking the question is right here. Hi. There, can you see better now? Yeah.
So is that a question for me, I'm guessing? Yeah.
For everyone, yeah.
I guess I won't speak to necessarily my presumption of the role of the artist. I think the artists play many roles, but I will say also that violence is part of everyday life in this country. It just is, on a individual level, on a kind of social level, on mass shootings, which are happening, unfortunately, much, much more frequently than they used to. But people are shot all of the time. I mean, we hear certain headlines, but it happens every day. It's not a rarity. It is a daily occurrence that there is gun violence in this country. So I just wanted to kind of mention that it's not the outlier. It's the norm. And the question is, what do we do about that? As artists, as cultural workers, I will say, as museums, I feel the public is holding us accountable to not being neutral, right? Kind of feigning neutrality on certain very important, relevant issues. And that's something that, as a museum director, I really think about, our responsibility to respond through art, through culture, through artists. Yeah.
I guess I would say the role of the artist is to pay attention and to keep paying attention, and to be present in their moment and contribute what they can. I think like Julie said, gun violence happens every single day. And for certain reasons, certain acts of violence are covered more than others. And certain populations are represented in the news media when they are the victims of that violence more than others. So I think it's all of our jobs to pay attention and to not forget and to bring those stories to a public and to do it truthfully and maybe in ways that aren't always comfortable. But yeah, I think paying attention is important.
It's interesting. I was thinking about this, you know, in relationship to Vietnam, when I think that the effect of the war and the impact of the war, obviously media and technology had something to do with sort of literally bringing that home to Americans, seeing what was happening on television. But it was also the idea that so many people were brought into that war that it was hard to not feel like you didn't have a connection to it, right? Like eventually someone you knew or someone in your family was killed or injured or in the war. And it seems like that's what's happening with the kind of pervasive gun violence you were talking about, the shooting. I mean, a close friend of mine's father was shot in Pittsburgh in that synagogue. And so it's harder and harder to literally not have a connection to it because of the pervasiveness of this. And so it is something that it feels like we have to ask ourselves, how can we, beyond a personal, but that might be the activating moment, how can we feel connected to this so that it, you know, how should we be connected? Like in the way that I think your work is asking us to connect to something that we can just say, this is an image on TV. It's not something that's in our world, you know, or in my world, say. Other questions? I see a hand down here, a couple of hands here.
I wanted to ask Mr. Giles, in the notes that we got here, it said, performers may be moving near you. And so I was expecting something else in this performance. And I wonder the way it's staged here, whether that is the way you envision it ideally as being staged, because the way it appears here, there's a separation between us and what's going on. Whereas if we were among the people who were falling down, it would be a different feeling, I think.
Right, totally. That is a product of conversations that I've had with folks at the MCA who supported this piece and been a part of planning it for this space. And probably the reason why there's this separation is because, you know, as you can see, we're on this proscenium stage, and there really isn't quite a lot of space amongst the audience. But that would be sort of an one way that I would have liked to see that play out, but because of space restrictions didn't happen. The original presentation of this piece was a solo performance performed by myself, and it was in a space that there was a screen for projection and no seats. And so I was really within the audience. So that was something I wanted to explore here, but just logistically didn't work out.
I'm not sure if I was next, but I borrowed the microphone. I'm curious about your thoughts on the role of the artist in relation to violence to actually create social change. I think about, say, for example, the iconic photo of Kent State comes to mind. I think of, in another period in history, Goya's horrific depictions of war that were so outrageous you couldn't even look at them even today without thinking of the horrors of war and affecting your attitudes toward it. And, you know, even pick up on the gun violence thing, I mean, we don't see as much horrific depiction of what is actually taking place that might in fact affect minds and people's ideas about about what we're doing, how we're voting, what we're thinking about when we think about gun violence. And so I'd be interested in your opinions on that, how that has changed. We don't have the Goyas of today doing what he did for war that I'm seeing in enough of places to make us really affect the public opinion.
I think it's for Greg. Do you want to respond? Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I don't know. That's really challenging because there's I'm not really sure exactly how to respond to that, because I know that there are some really dedicated photographers and others who try to go out and try their best to depict these scenes. There's always the concern that you're going to exploit and take advantage of the victims of these violent actions. And I think that artists are very concerned about that role in this as well. And so, like, part of my response is, yes, there are people who are doing that. There are photographers who are attempting to go into war zones or to go into communities where these issues are happening. I'm thinking here of, Carlos Javier Ortiz and some of his photographs here in Chicago and some of the work that he's done in communities that have been affected by gun violence. And I guess part of me would say that, yeah, there are. I mean, there's a little bit of a Goya-ish sensibility to some of that work. I do think that maybe one of the differences is that at this point, those images, which are real images of real communities and real individuals who've been impacted from violence, are competing against a much bigger image stream. And it's really the signal to noise ratio of trying to compete with an image stream that's been created by popular media and the violence that you see there that you can easily shrug off. You can see a really violent movie or a television show or whatever on Netflix and kind of shrug it off. But I think one of the unintended consequences is you're spending time consuming those fictionalized versions of violence that you don't pay as much attention to the real images of violence. So, I mean, maybe it's our media habits and how we can adjust that. I don't know. That's my quick response. It's a good question.
But I think social media allows us to have direct access to the real violence, too. There is a bombardment of images through Twitter, social media, Instagram, the news. And I think allowing artists to be artists and responding in their own way is how we best support artists. I think they can bring awareness. If I may, I thought Ed Paschke had a really interesting quote in the 1968 Art and Violence.
Looking at that.
Where he said, an artist cannot influence what will happen in society. He can only observe and comment on its past. But even in commenting on the past, he cannot be literal. He can only reflect on history as it happened to him. His paintings are his emotional responses to his part in the story, to history as it happened to him. Such influence is always indirect.
I have something else to maybe add to that too, is that maybe the expectation that there would be a Goya or that there'd be like a heroic artist figure out there who's going to find these images for us is too much of an expectation now, because I think the images of violence that have actually affected tremendous change are the ones that weren't made with the intention to make that change. I'm thinking of the Abu Ghraib prison photographs, not made by an artist, not made with the intention at all of exposing the injustice that happened there. The same with dash cam footage of police shootings. To me, as soon as you said social media, I'm like, yeah, the thing that really impacts me to think about gun violence is if I can stand to watch all the way through one of those dash cam videos and see a horrific act of violence perpetuated against an actual human being, that is to me stunning. And so maybe it's beyond the hands of the artist because it's in the realm of these other images that exist out there.
Or think about the students of Parkland who were able to take the images they captured of what was happening to them and organize a movement around that. So again, maybe it is about this kind of citizen journalism. I would just plug that John Moore, who took the photo on the U.S.-Mexico border of the young girl crying, as her mother was being arrested by the Border Patrol, he's going to be in the festival. And that photo became a flashpoint for our conversation around immigration policy, but he's been photographing the border for over a decade. So, he has a much more expansive idea of what's actually happening. And so I think sometimes it is getting beyond social media headlines and those provocative images to try and understand what's truly happening. I realize that we're running out of time, and I wanted to, first of all, thank the MCA, and particularly January, and Christy Lemaster and January Parker Athos from the education program for being such great collaborators on this program, and also to thank, on behalf of the MCA, the Christina Barr Lectures, which were established through a generous gift from the Barr Fund to the Chicago Contemporary Campaign. So they were part of who made this program possible, as is the Terra Foundation for American Art. We talked about the Ralph Arnold Show. That's part of the Terra initiative. There's so much work right now that if you're interested in these questions around art and violence, that you can go out and see the Afro-Cobra program at the Smart Museum. But I wanted to bring Amy Zink from the Terra Foundation onto the stage just to kind of wrap us up and let us know a little bit more about that initiative that this program is also part of. So Amy Zink is here.
This is going to work. For taking on a subject that is so real to us on a daily basis, unfortunately. The Terra Foundation has been fortunate to be able to partner with organizations such as the Chicago Humanities Festival and Graphic this year. Over 75 cultural institutions around Chicago and beyond have joined in a collective conversation, a collective project to explore and celebrate the city's dynamic history of art and design by putting forward more than 30 exhibitions, which we hope many of you have seen, and hundreds of events through 2018. You know, tonight we really heard about stories about how Chicago has been a hotbed for art as social response, art as activism. This has always been part of Chicago's DNA, from the art programs of the Hull House to Stony Island Arts Bank and elsewhere. The topic of art as response, as Alison put it, you'll be able to see, we hope, it's represented, especially in these years, the 60s and the 70s that we were talking about tonight, in exhibitions and projects that are happening right now around the city. I'll just name a few of them because I would hate for you to miss out on them, knowing the interest you had tonight in this subject. And in these final 2 months of ADC as I call it, Art Design Chicago, in addition to the Ralph Arnold show, Greg's wonderful show at the Museum of Contemporary Art, you'll need to see that just to be able to view yourself that recently rediscovered triptych that you mentioned, created for the 1968 MCA Violence exhibition. Julie at DePaul as well, tomorrow, besides being engaged all day in the Northside Design Day, which we hope you'll all be able to participate in, there's also a fascinating exhibition on Yasuhiro Ishimoto, if you've missed it. The Time Is Now at the Smart Museum. Okay, the title, I think we can all gravitate towards that as we've talked about what's happening tonight. And this show highlights artists' relationship to the civil rights movement and where the future came from at Columbia College's Glass Curtain Gallery, which focuses on feminist art collectives. We encourage you to explore all these programs in these final 2 months of Art Design Chicago. And, you know, Danny, when you mentioned the role of artists or citizens as to pay attention, right? Part of protest and activism is action. And although we aren't going to be able to maybe personally solve all of what we're talking about tonight, we do ask that you just go see it. We ask that you take advantage of these wonderful opportunities to see artists and how they've reflected society, the statements they've made. And as we all know here, that art will work on us. This concludes tonight's events. Thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you in many other programs soon. Tomorrow night, in fact, there's a discussion again with Chicago Humanities Festival at the Art Institute with original members of the Chicago Art Collective, the Harry Who. Thank you again, and good night.